So, today I'm going to be talking about the relationship between creativity, autonomy, and human connection. And you might be asking yourself, why is this even important to the conversation? It's very important to the conversation because I'm going to be looking particularly at the years of 1960 to 1972, 1973, somewhere in there, and comparing what artists and creators then went through and the lives that they lived and what artists and creators are doing today living this. And my main question as I've been exploring this here is, how do people stay authentic while creating within systems that shape what gets seen and that shape what gets rewarded and what gets pushed to the audiences? How do creators live within that box and still be free? Because creativity needs freedom. That's what this whole idea of the creator economy was built on, was freedom. Freedom to do what you want to do, how you want to do it. And now we're being told reverse engineer. See what somebody else is doing successful and do that in your own way. That doesn't sound like freedom to me. And that doesn't sound like creative autonomy to me. So audiences or artists need an audience. They need somebody to see their work. That's where supposedly algorithms come into play at. So what happens is systems that are in place right now, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, whatever, these algorithms, these systems influence both the creator and the audience. So where's the freedom for the creator and for the audience? It's a real question. Now, great creativity needs some sort of freedom. It needs room to breathe, room to grow. In the American world, that's what our society was kind of built on: autonomy and room to grow, room to expand without rules and limits. And it seems like everywhere we look today, like with other parts of society, there's more rules and more restrictions and more, you can't do this or you need to do it this way, than we've ever had before. How is that constructive? Now, at the same time that artists need this freedom and this ability to create, artists usually want their work to reach a lot of people and to be seen by new audiences, right? And that's a real interesting place to be if you're an artist, because you need to be seen. You need to be thrown out into the abyss, right? You need to find a certain level of comfort within your audience. And this is something that I think artists have struggled with for a very long time. But now the problem with this is that every single era has systems that shape visibility, that shape creative ability. We've seen this all throughout art in general, dating back to the beginning of art, right? We've seen this. Systems are always in place to restrict, to govern, and to manage what the artist is free to create. Is that a good thing? Now, in the 1960s, we're focusing here a lot on the 60s and 70s. In the 60s and 70s, artists were limited by labels, by journalists, by radio, by critics. They were limited by a lot of these things. Today, artists are limited by the algorithms, by metrics, and by platform incentives. Just recently we saw an AI song completed entirely by AI go to number one on Billboard. How do we manage this? How are we free to create if something totally fake can rise to the top? So academically speaking here, I've been looking at self-determination theory in all of this. I've been looking at Deci and Ryan talking about their autonomy and self-determination and how this plays a huge part in this. And you have to, if you look at some of this and you start studying this SDT, this self-determination theory, and we can get into the nuts and bolts of what that is and how that works. But you need your autonomy. You need this creative flow that goes back to some other literature. You need relatableness. You need to be relatable to the audience. You need to have a competence. You know, some research says that you have to practice a skill for 10, 15 years before you become totally competent in that skill. These are things that you need. You need a talent. You need to refine that talent. And then you have to figure out how to get that talent to market. And a lot of times this boils back to how much determination you have within yourself. So when we read people like Deci and Ryan, right, and we come to understand this self-determination theory, right, this helps explain what supports healthy motivation, what keeps you going, what keeps you moving forward even when the algorithms change. Self-determination theory, as I understand it now, says people do better when three basic needs are met: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Now, autonomy means that you're feeling like you're self-directed, like you're in control, like you're moving this thing along in the right direction, right? Competence means that you're feeling skilled, you're feeling able, you're feeling effective in whatever it is that you're trying to do. Relatedness means that you're feeling meaningfully connected with other people who are appreciating your work that you're doing. Within country music, for instance, a lot of American country music artists found homes in Europe with an entirely new audience who appreciated their music and appreciated what they were doing, right? So they left the comforts and the problems of the United States and they went to Europe so they could be free to create without a bunch of restrictions. Now, this matters. This matters a lot because creativity is often the strongest when it comes from internal motivation rather than outside pressure. And artists have always had this outside pressure. Like I say, either it's from critics, perhaps it's from radio, disc jockeys, A&R people, accountants, whoever it is, the people that create these metrics for creators to create by. They've always faced problems. And they've always created outside pressure. The artist and the creator does better when that outside pressure is totally removed. And they feel like they are the ones that are in control of their own destiny. Now, another part that I want to talk about here, and part of understanding this is getting his name right, but Csikszentmihalyi, Mali, whatever, I'll link it below. I'm still trying to figure out how to pronounce this guy's name right, but a Hungarian, I'll call him a psychologist, philosopher, whatever you want to call him, studied things like deep immersion, and he studied this intrinsic reward in people. And he studied the loss of self-consciousness and came up with this idea called flow. And flow, as he describes it, and as I understand it now, is the state of being fully absorbed in whatever it is that you're doing. You're entrenched in this. You're doing it simply for the love of doing it. Not because you have to, but because you enjoy doing it. In flow, he says that people become deeply focused and the activity becomes rewarding in itself. And as we study journalists or athletes or business professionals or whoever, we start seeing that when they're totally immersed and the activity becomes an enjoyment, they do better. Artists often produce their best work when they work under these conditions. They're in the flow. They're in the zone. They're able to create better. And how do they achieve this flow? When they're not being restricted. So flow helps us explain the intensity and the originality that we often associate with major creative figures. Okay, no matter who they are. I'm going to give you a few examples of that now. So let's take the American poet, Bob Dylan. Now, Bob Dylan is still today, an incredible artist. I mean, Highway 61 revisited. It's All Right, Ma. I'm Only Dying. Tangled Up in Blue. Some great American anthems that explained America not only then, but helps us understand America now as it is. But Bob Dylan resisted expectations. He doesn't do, even today, a lot of interviews with people. Because Bob Dylan was constantly avoiding the pressures of the people and the society that placed restrictions on him. When Bob Dylan wanted to, he was a folk artist, right? He was playing a lot of this early in his career, he was playing a lot of this guitar songs and, just kind of folksy music like Pete Seeger and, people like this, some Peter, Paul and Mary kind of stuff, right? But then he reinvented himself, which is what I want to talk about now. The artist reinvents themselves and they come up with a new idea. Well, when he emerges out of this, Bob Dylan becomes a little more electric. Like, let's say, Highway 61 revisited. This reinvention protected Dylan's autonomy, his ability to create. But also what it protected him from being within a box. And creating things as we understand creativity now, everything points to being outside the box. You can't be within a box and create truly unique artwork for yourself. And Bob Dylan was very good at that. Now, Dylan's a strong example of autonomy. And I want to get into that. Okay, so we already know that Bob Dylan resisted expectations and that he constantly reinvented himself, right? That he worked on protecting his autonomy as a person and as a creator. But Bob Dylan is perhaps, like I say, one of the most strongest examples of autonomy within creativity because he refused to remain the kind of artist that audiences expected him to be. Now, if you look at YouTube, I'm going to pick YouTube out of this for a minute. YouTube expects you to be one audience. Niche, they say. Niche down. I hate this word. They tell you to niche down. Do one thing and do it well. Only talk about one thing. Only present in one way. Find your niche. That right there is killing creative autonomy in itself. This is killing the creative autonomy. And how do we know this? We know this because science teaches us that artists produce their best when they don't have restrictions. The algorithm has already placed a restriction on you by telling you to niche down, to become very unique, present everything in a specific way. What's working, don't change it. You know who said this? Record labels, A&R people, accountants in the 1960s. They said this. Don't change. Once you find what works, don't change. Just keep doing it. And that's why artists get stuck in this rut of doing the same thing over and over again. Well, someone much smarter than I once said doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, is the definition of insanity. So if you never change, you never adapt, and you never grow, how do you expect to find new audiences? Now, I talked a little bit about this before. Bob Dylan changed. He refused to stay the kind of person that people wanted him to be. He refused to stay the kind of person that the accountants, the A&R people, the audience expected him to be. In many aspects, Bob Dylan did exactly what Rick Rubin suggests, the great music producer Rick Rubin. The audience comes last. When the world of algorithms, they say the audience comes first, but don't worry about the audience, you just create. But then everything they do tells you to worry about the audience. This whole system is designed to strip away your autonomy. And we're seeing that more and more and more. Now, what can we learn from Bob Dylan? Bob Dylan is the prime example of self-determination theory. Why? Because Bob Dylan created on Bob Dylan's terms. He did it without people micromanaging him. And he resisted the urge to allow people to do that to him. Dylan reminds us in a weird sort of way that authenticity sometimes means disappointing people in order to remain true to your work. You're going to hurt people. Now, maybe not physically, but emotionally, you may hurt some people. You may alienate some people. And you have to decide whether or not offending people is worth staying true to yourself. That's the real question. Next up, I want to talk a little bit about the Grateful Dead. The Grateful Dead, Jerry Garcia, Bob Weir, the Grateful Dead. San Francisco at its best, when music could be truly at its best. They were magical at improvisation. They were geniuses when it came to experimentation. And they were absolutely phenomenal when it came to audience engagement and community and creating a shared experience around their work. Now, the Grateful Dead, and I'm a fan. I'm probably by far not a Deadhead, but I'm a fan of the Grateful Dead. And they represent, though, another side of creativity because their music was very improvised. It was very experimental. Every show that they did every single night was different, no matter where they went. And they encouraged the audience to tape their music, to record their music. Because first off, I think they realized they couldn't stop it. So they encouraged it. This led to a greater fan base, to a more loyal fan base. And the Grateful Dead, within their concerts, because of these tapers, that's what they called them, tapers, this inclusion of the things that the A&R people and the accountants said, no, don't allow this in your concerts. By including this, they created a deeper community around their work and around their music. Now, what does this do? This represents something that oftentimes the people that work in offices don't have because they're not the most creative people. Competence in creativity. Now, maybe they're creative in one way, and maybe they're creative in a businessy sort of way, but they're not true creatives, and they don't understand what the creative goes through. And I've had this argument myself negotiating creative contracts over the years. You have to have experience, and you have to have room to create. And you have to have room to include people and things that are often overlooked. Now, the Grateful Dead, they were able to have autonomy. They were able to have relatedness. They were able to have competence. They were able to do all of this together with their audience. And this reflects in their performance. They were collective. There was a shared flow between the members of the band, the audience, the consumers, if you will. And that was a true reflection of flow. And this is where our understanding of it now is that we see the greatest performers who really excelled and lasted over time had this flow and autonomy. And the algorithmic age complicates this. We're in an age where algorithm lives everywhere. As a creator, your visibility is platform driven. It's algorithm driven. Whether they say it is or it isn't, it is. Because the algorithms are the platforms themselves. And the metrics that we see shape the behaviors of people. You know, I was recently researching some of these people because deep down I'm kind of an av geek, and I was researching a lot of these people who were going out and buying airplanes and learning to fly and creating YouTube videos about this, right? And when they crash, there was a real public incident of this with, I think it was called Tennessee Fly Girl or something. Goes out, buys an airplane, becomes a pilot, takes some much longer than normal to become a pilot, and really struggles with the whole concept of becoming a pilot. Gets involved in a tragic accident, takes herself out. Luckily, it was just herself, sadly, but luckily it was just herself. Why? Because her instructors, if you go back and read the NTSB report, the instructors say that she was always more worried about her iPad, her GoPro, her phone, creating content while flying. And when a basic problem arrives, she doesn't know how to handle it because she's not competent. She missed that lesson because she was on her phone. She ends up crashing the plane and it kills her. That's one example of what we're seeing across YouTube. Is it's creating people to do stupid things in order to get attention. And it's costing them their lives. And then we have to ask ourselves the question about the pressures of being a creator, the pressures of being someone on this side of the camera. Do you start to do things that aren't normal to you? Maybe they're not the safest thing to do. Maybe they're not the wisest thing to do. One character that I've been looking at very recently is Alex Honnold, the solo climber, who recently climbed Taipei 101. A very accomplished freestyle mountain climber, right? Why would you go and climb a building? It's a question I think that deserves asked. Was it because Netflix breeded publicity and you somehow needed a little more publicity? I don't know. I haven't asked him this question. I don't know how to get a hold of it. But I think it's worth the conversation. So authenticity in whatever it is that you're doing becomes very pressured. Now, today, creators face a very different system than what creators in the 1960s faced. Let's take a look at that. I mentioned this earlier that creators in the 1960s were facing problems with like A&R people, accountants, promoters, They were facing problems with disc jockeys, with critics, with all kinds of people. But today, creators are facing a very different thing. Instead of facing off with labels or critics, they deal with platforms and they deal with algorithms. And we've already kind of established this. These systems that are in place shape who and what gets discovered and what audiences see them. And that ultimately, I think, as I understand it now, takes a toll on the creator, psychologically, emotionally, physically. And we have to ask ourselves, what is this doing to people? These systems that we see in place today with these algorithms that they tell you not to worry about, you end up worrying about these algorithms because you understand that you know that that's how you get discovered. These algorithms are extremely oftentimes unfair. Now, creators are also told to be authentic. They're told to be themselves, but only in ways that are visible and only in ways that are rewarded. So be yourself, but don't be too much of yourself. And this creates tension between self-expression and performance for the system. So we end up asking ourselves, how much performance are you doing for the sake of performance? And how much is it just becoming an obligation? You know, if you look at this from the standpoint of authors, I'm a pretty good fan of Westerns and folk writing. If you look at things like writers like Larry McMurtry, they write hundreds of books over their careers. And perhaps they're only known for one or two, maybe three. You can't always have a publicist behind you like Stephen King and then always get on the New York Times bestseller list. You could write, trash and it would be on the New York Times bestseller list. But a lot of writers write hundreds of books and find very limited success in that. But why do they write? Because they have the autonomy, the freedom to write what they want. The freedom to write what they want, how they want. And that's a unique place to be in because one side of the economy, the world, creator world today, tells us that our economy allows for that. But then on the other side of it, it really doesn't because it places everything in boxes. So authentic creativity needs autonomy. You need to have it. Flow, as we understand it now, deepens the creative work within the people. And there's still a lot of research that needs to be done on this topic. But we also need to look at human connections. We also need to use the system without becoming the system. And you can begin to see where all of this research comes in to play together to answer the bigger question. And that's what the expressive space framework and the expressive space lab is all about, is figuring out ways to support creators, support platforms, and support audiences. At least that's what it is now. So the major lesson here that we've learned so far, early on in this research, we've learned that creativity thrives under autonomy, under immersion, and meaningful connection. It has to. That's how creativity works. Now, artists from the 1960s helped show us what that can look like. People like Joni Mitchell, Buffy Sainte-Marie, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, Neil Young, Bob Dylan. Now today, the challenge is even more difficult because systems are more constant and they're more invasive than they ever were. And the goal is not to ignore the systems completely. It can't be that. The goal is to use these systems strategically without allowing it to define who we are. So I want to leave you with this. Authentic creativity depends on autonomy, on flow, and on human connection. But in every era, the artist must decide how to move through the system without letting the system become themselves. Thank you very much.